Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this next conversation about the important role of women in business. As I'm sure you all are aware, over the past 3-ish years, maybe since April 2020, we've had a lot of interesting conversations about the role of women and minorities, people of color in business. And we've made some progress. We've also had some setbacks. And that's what we're here to discuss today. So without further ado, let me introduce to you all our all-star panel who's going to dive into these very complex and important issues. Next to me, I have from FinDev, Chief Executive Lori Kerr. On the end, we have Paulette Sr., who is the Chief Executive of the Canadian Women's Foundation. Thank you for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, in the middle, joining us all the way from Paris, is Élisabeth Richard from ENGIE, where she is the Head of Executive Coordination and Networks, and she is also in charge of Leadership for Women. So Lori, I kind of want to start with you. Tell me a little bit about what you have seen over these past few years when it comes to conversations around women in the business world.
Thank you so much. So first, it's a pleasure to be here, and perhaps just to level set on FinDev Canada, since some of you may be less familiar. So FinDev Canada, we're Canada's bilateral development finance institution. We were established in 2018. We provide financing and investment, blended finance solutions, technical assistance and knowledge to support sustainable and inclusive growth in emerging markets and developing economies. We have 3 impact lenses through which we look when we make all of our financing and investment decisions. The first is climate action. The second is market development. And the third, very apropos for today's conversation, is gender equality and women's economic empowerment. We operate in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and next year we'll be expanding into the Indo-Pacific region as well. So just a little bit of a level set on FinDev Canada. We operate in emerging markets. So I wanted to sort of take a step back from the question that you asked and also level set sort of around where we are and what the effects of the pandemic have been. So we know certainly from the World Bank and many other sources that the COVID-19 pandemic has been very devastating in terms of poverty and in terms of its impact on inequality. Developing countries in particular have had longer crises and deeper crises, and it's taking a longer time to recover. And in terms of emerging markets, Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa have been particularly hard hit. And we know that even around this idea or the negative impacts of COVID and the global pandemic, women have been particularly hard hit. Women have lost more jobs and more income associated with the pandemic. And so part of the conversation, and it was alluded to a little bit a moment ago, is why do we care? Why are we even here and having this conversation? And just to level set in terms of some of the opportunities, there's a lot of real benefits to the economy and the society for better integrating women and other forms of diversity across the business set. And just want to take you through just a couple of examples. One is unemployment. So as we all can imagine, women make up about 50% of the population, but women are under and unemployed at greater rates than men. Moody's Analytics earlier this year came out with an analysis, and it showed that if there were more women in the workforce, $7 trillion could be added to the global economy. Imagine that. An earlier WEF study said that if women had equal employment to men, what was the number? It was $28 trillion could be added to global GDP. So there's a huge opportunity in terms of employment. Consumers. Women make 60 to 80% of consumer spending decisions. So that is $15 trillion worth of consumer spending that women have control over. The business case, as was mentioned a moment ago, firms with gender diverse boards and senior management have higher sales, higher return on equity, and lower risk around earnings. And very last, the climate case. Banks with more gender diverse boards lend more for green and less for brown, and firms with more gender diverse boards and management have better emissions performance. In fact, the European Commission did a study after Paris and found statistically significant firms with more gender diverse boards had 5% lower CO2 emissions than other firms. So a huge amount of opportunity around women. So what's changed, and how are the conversations evolving? So despite all of this backsliding, there's actually been a lot of positive movement. The rates of women employment The rates of women being part of boards have increased a little bit of a slower pace than they have been before the pandemic, but there is positive traction, which is really positive. And in the business that I'm in terms of emerging markets, there's positive conversations with all of our clients and potential clients around taking a gender lens look at the work that they're doing and certainly the support that we provide them. So positive traction and certainly positivity for the future.
That's great to hear. Paulette, I want to come to you next. I know you work with a lot of corporate partners. What have you seen from them over the past 2 years? And have there been any concrete impacts from the initiatives that we've seen?
Sure. So always good to be sitting on the stage with such accomplished women. And thank you all for being here. And first, let me say that the Canadian Women's Foundation is Canada's National Foundation for Gender Justice and Equality. So that's a level set that I'm going to do, so you know from which perspective I'm speaking. But in terms of concrete movements that we've seen, we've actually seen what I would call a level of engagement from corporate partners that we haven't seen in the past, where corporate partners are actually realizing that it's important that they are attending to the issues of the day, that they are listening to their employees. I didn't pose for that. and that they are understanding the importance of leadership in making the kinds of commitments that are necessary to not just talk about the issues, but actually practice what they are talking about. So, and ESG goals, of course, is one of those. So, in terms of building the flexibility that people are demanding, that staff are demanding, that is a critical piece of the kinds of concrete things that that needs to be implemented, that we're seeing implemented, that respond to the needs, and understanding the realities, the full realities of women's lives who are caregivers across the age spectrum. And therefore, the kind of flexibility they need to really be productive in their jobs is greater flexibility. So whether that means being able to have hybrid models, or whether that means in terms of when they start working, or maybe splitting up their days, those are important elements to look for around that kind of flexibility. And when people can have that flexibility, they're more economically productive, right? In terms of leadership commitments, I think it's important to understand that that the commitments that we're making around the issues that are circulating in society, so that whether that has to be with different kinds of what's happening within LGBTQ communities, what's happening in terms of gender equality generally, understanding that people from racialized backgrounds are the ones that are least benefited in terms of the changes that are being made in society, and that when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and even leadership of women, like Laura mentioned, that there needs to be recognition that leadership is a critical part of what needs to happen. So not just being at the table, but being able to measure the progress that needs to happen, and to have targets, to have goals that can be achieved. Because sometimes we talk it, but we don't do it. And I think that whether we're talking about ESG goals or SDG goals, sustainable development goals, that employers are watching to see what we're doing, not just in terms of the policies, but the practices. And that, folks are able to feel welcome, that they know that there's a sense of belonging, that they belong in these workplaces, because we're building that. And the leadership that's required is a leadership that understands that these issues are complex, and that just adding a group or adding women and stirring is not the solution. Right? So stirring us all in a nice big pot is not going to solve the issues. That there needs to be an understanding of what are the barriers we're facing, and put in place the kind of practices that need to address them and break down those barriers.
Absolutely. That comment about stirring us all together reminded me of a story that, Élisabeth, you told me earlier today when we were catching up back in the lounge about a Zoom call that changed a conversation you were having with some of your senior leaders. Can you tell us about that?
What happened after the COVID, you mean? Okay. It's a sad story, but it's a story which has changed things in France a little bit within my company. I work for ENGIE. ENGIE is a huge group in energy, utilities, 100 billions of euros, 100,000 people. I've been working on gender equality for ages, nearly 17 years. And I've always tried to bring the subject of domestic violence in my company. And my chairman was always saying, okay, Élisabeth, you're doing a lot, but private and professional life, it's not the same. So please just get concentrated. Okay. And we were all locked down and watching TV every day in France. They were saying, watch out, if you listen to a weird noise, please call the police, please call the 3919, please do it. There is a lot of violence, domestic violence now during the lockdown. Okay. I chair a very huge network in my company of women in networking, and I know them quite well for 15 years, so I know them. And I was speaking with few of them, and I could feel that some of them weren't well. And I was sure that statistically, women from my company had domestic violence. So I decided by myself to organize a Zoom with 20 women that I know, though I know them. So I know if something is well or is doing well or not. So I did it with 20 of them on Zoom. And a consultant, because I wanted someone from outside of the company. And we started with the camera on. And you know that during this lockdown, we could see your house. Now it's finished. We all have a special image, a picture of your mountains but before we could see where you were when we started that. And so I saw women in gardens with birds singing. Everything was well, was getting well. And few women, and I could see that it didn't get well. And suddenly we were all speaking and debating and how is your agenda? Are you okay with the kids and how is doing things and life? Everybody was speaking, and suddenly in a room of one of our colleagues, a man entered and slapped the woman in a violence you can't imagine, and the computer fell down and finished. So I had to say to everyone, okay, I'm sorry, we are going to take care of this woman, don't worry, please, I will call you back, we have to stop. And I took my courage and I decided to call the chairman, the chair of the board of the group, and the chairman, he was the chair of the group, saying, okay, you wanted proofs? I have one. We are 20 women having seen something which couldn't happen. And we can't carry on like that. And he said, okay. So now you do whatever we will do an action plan, and we will open the way and show to other groups that it's not a question of private and professional life. Now things have changed, and we have to show that, and we have to accompany women who are working in our companies, because it's not only ENGIE, it's all the companies, and help women. And since then, the 8 million clients of the group in France receive a bill with the numbers of emergencies. We've done this for 2 years, and we are going to carry on up. We eradicate this terrible thing.
I think that's great. Well, I think that is a fantastic example of how businesses can make a difference. And obviously, I wish it had come about from better circumstances. But Lori, I want to ask you, in emerging markets, like, what is the equivalent of putting emergency contact information on a bill?
That's a really powerful story. Thank you so much for sharing it. And maybe to share just a couple of examples how FinDev Canada approaches the work with our clients to address some of the very complicated and personal issues that you've just shared with us. So as I mentioned before, climate action, market development, and gender equality, women's economic empowerment are 3 impact goals. So we've integrated a gender lens since the very beginning of our operations, and so we look to go beyond compliance in terms of looking at what are local laws and regulations, and in terms of how a company should be conducting its operations, being part of the development finance community. And those of you who are in the banking community, the Equator principles. So we work with the IFC performance standards. So there's also things related to human rights and anti-harassment and gender-based violence. And there's a certain set of performance standards that we also apply to our work. But beyond the sort of the compliance and the safeguarding aspect, what we also look to do is try and provide value added to our clients. And so through our technical assistance programming and through our advisory services that we provide, we work with clients to try and help them on their gender journey. And I can give a couple of examples. So one of our clients is called Myro Forestry. They are a sustainable timber company that operates on 20,000 hectares of sustainably managed timber in Sierra Leone and Ghana. They have 8,000 hectares under conservation management as well. And this is a very male-dominated industry. So through our technical assistance program and through our advisory services, we work with them and help them on their gender journey. To help integrate more, aspects around gender-based violence, around equality of employment, around pay, around revamping human resources policies to be more helpful and encouraging for women employment. And again, in a very male-dominated industry, they have 40% of employment of women, which is actually pretty remarkable because they've created a safe environment. They've created internal policies that are actually welcoming of women employees. And so we're trying to be value-added and, again, help them on their journey of gender equality and women's economic empowerment. I'll share one other quick story. There's another client that we're working with. It's called Climate Investor Fund, and it's a fund. It's actually 3 funds essentially that's investing in renewable energy in emerging markets. And when we first started talking with this client, gender equality, women's economic empowerment, it wasn't something that they really ever thought about. But again, we engaged with them and had the conversations. And the CEO of that company, Andrew Johnstone, about a year ago, he said to me, because now they're doing a lot of really great things in terms of women's economic empowerment, both at the fund level as well as at their investee level. I can get into more specifics on that. But the one thing he told me is that what FinDev Canada did is provided him acute awareness of the opportunities and the issues around women's economic empowerment and gender equality. And I think that that's something that's really important because some of the barriers and challenges, and again, I'm speaking more specifically around gender and women's economic empowerment, but it's also, other forms of diversity and intersectionality. Of course, the same holds true, is that there's a lot of information asymmetries. There's a lot of lack of awareness. And so providing that acute awareness is the first step, I think, in addressing some of the challenges that many companies face, whether that's in emerging markets or whether it's in developed markets as well.
In 60 seconds, could you tell us what business leaders need to know when it comes to women's economic empowerment? If any of us happen to not be up to date.
Well, so what I would say is be curious, right? I mean, if you don't ask the question, you're not going to get the information. And it's not up to the women to sort of push the information. It's up to everyone to also want the information and understand what the implications are. So I would say educate yourself. We need to do a lot more on sort of data and information, of course, but be curious, ask the questions, understand the opportunities, as well as understand the risk that you're putting not just your business into, but actually your employees into if you're not taking these things seriously. So I guess maybe be curious and beyond be curious, be action-oriented.
Paulette, that leads me into a question for you. What do you encourage your corporate partners to do to have that action orientation?
I'm still resonating from the story, and so it's always important that when folks hear a story like this, to know that there's support, And it leads me to why back in 2020, we worked with a PR firm to create the Signal for Change. let me do it properly, the signal for change. So the signal for change is really a non-digital tool that we created because we knew that when women who are in abusive situations are home with their abusers, that they would be in more danger. And we saw the spikes, not just in Canada, but globally, right? And it really is a tool that says, I need you to check in with me safely because something is not good or something is awry. So I just want folks to remember that. And what we've been able to do since creating that tool in terms of our corporate partners is actually do trainings with them because they actually care about their employees. And they want to make sure that, especially as we're living in this sort of hybrid model where folks are working more at home, but it is still the workplace, even though they're home, to also be responsible and accountable for making sure that folks are safe. And so we do training with corporate organizations to help employees so that they understand how they can better help their employees if they're experiencing any issues around their safety at home. And we're actually quite inspired by the number of corporations that are interested in learning what to do and moving away from this is not business to how do we show we care about the people who work for us. And I find that really a change in how we look at things. And I think that's one of the benefits of the pandemic, where we've had to really demonstrate that the people who work for us are people with whole lives, not just the lives they show up with at the office. And even though there's legislation around all of that, it's how do we actually develop a culture that demonstrates that people's lives matter, and that there is actually something we can do in terms of keeping people safe. So that's one of the things that we're seeing with our corporate partners. And also taking the time to learn about what the systemic barriers are that people are facing, right? Because you can't address the issues if you don't know how it affects people's lives. You can't address the issue if you don't understand that, you know, the double, triple burden of having an intersectional identity, which could have to do with sexual orientation, could have to do with racial background, could have to do with disabilities, that all of those things are barriers to people's full participation as well as to their productivity. And so learning about that is really part of the journey that we're on with our corporate partners, that we can be beneficial to them and that they can have healthier work environments and, in fact, healthier people who work within those environments.
Absolutely. And we've primarily focused on business solutions, which is the topic of this panel. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there are other institutions that could play a role in removing some of these systemic barriers that some people face in the business world. And Élisabeth, I know you've worked on legislation in France around this topic, around quotas. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And, you know, could I see something like that in Washington soon?
Yes, well, I'm not 80 years old, but I could, having worked on this subject for such many years. So in 2006, I was working with a minister, and I was in a private company, but I helped the minister to work on law in feminization of boards, women in boards. So it's called the law Copé-Zimmermann. And this law obliged the company, the CAC 40, and afterwards the SBF 120, to have 60 and 40 from a gender or another. Okay? And I remember at that time all the men that I could meet in my company, but not only, they were just laughing and ha, but we don't have enough women. Well, we are half of the humanity. half of the active population, but okay. We don't find them. Can't find them. And you know what? Now, in 2023, we have in France average 50% of women on boards. And you know what? It's the first time that in France as well, because we have this law, we decided to create a special learning and formation for women, for people on boards. So we professionalized this job, actually. That's very interesting. The second one was the gender pay gap, the index PENICO, the index of the former labor minister. And we decided to impose to the company to have a special notation. You say notation? Annotation? A notation on 100. And we could measure, because we were always saying that we had something like 25% difference between my job and the job of my colleague man. But it was just like that. We couldn't measure. So we decided in France to create this index. And so since 2017 now, we've got this index and we know, and all the managers know that there are differences between men and women, and they have the obligation to catch this pay gap. So that's very interesting. And it forces companies to help women on this inequality. And the third one was from last year with Marie-Pierre Rixin, the law Rixin, on the feminization of the executive committee. Because, you know, in France, they said, okay, the board, okay. But for the executive committee, it's another thing. No, it's the same. And so we created this law asking 40% of women in the executive committee by 5 years. And now we are nearly at 30%. So what does it mean, all those laws in France? It means that if you measure, you progress. And we have to measure this up as another thing. It's easy. We have to do that. And the thing is as well, when you have law in a company, we follow the law. We don't just doing things. So it's very important. That's why we are working a lot on this, hand in hand with the government.
I'd love to pick up on what Élisabeth just shared. I was at the OECD in Paris last week, speaking at the Green Finance and Investment Summit, and I learned of a new initiative. Several of my co-panelists were speaking about it. People are familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and now the Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Well, there's a new initiative underway called the Task Force for Social and Inequality-Related Disclosures, and it exactly goes to this point. If we don't measure, then how are we going to manage? So it's sort of a global movement to make disclosures around social issues, diversity, inclusion, et cetera, gender, visible. Try to rallying around global measures and metrics. What does good look like? It's obviously very local context specific, but I think it's a very interesting example of piggybacking on some of these voluntary disclosure standards. They're not voluntary in every country, mind you, but voluntary disclosure standards that are becoming mandatory from climate and nature and now into social inequality. So very interesting movement afoot.
Definitely. Now, we've spent a lot of this panel talking about solutions, potential solutions we've worked on ourselves. But I think it's also important to take a moment to talk about some of the barriers that still remain. Paulette, I want to ask you, as the global economic outlook has changed, as the geopolitical situation is rapidly changing as well, are you afraid that corporations will take back some of the initiatives and pledges that have been made in recent years?
Yes, but I hope not.
Hope not.
I've been hearing stories that trouble me, and some of those stories circle around particular women, particular racialized women who have been hired to address issues of diversity, equity, inclusion in some corporations are being let go. And that troubles me because this is work that is best done when it can work at the level of culture change and culture shift. And then it makes me also worried, because were we only paying lip service because it looked good at the time? And this kind of work of diversity, equity, inclusion, to me, are verbs. They require action, but I think they also require the kind of action where the commitment is about transforming the culture of exclusion to inclusion, right? And as you say, being visible and transparent about the progress that's being made, and knowing that it is not a 1 year or 5 year work, but that it is a journey of learning. And that's why, in terms of the approach that we're taking, for organizations that sign up to work with us, they know what they're signing up for. And because of some of the work they're doing, either through their leadership or their ESGs that they've identified through their staff that are, committed and saying this is what's important, because of that scenario, then we're able to work at the level of creating learning opportunities. And a learning organization is an organization that is committed to change, is an organization that is open to learning what they don't know. And then the level of commitment that it takes from the leadership, but also understanding that when you're learning, it's actually improving not just the, understanding of the issues, but it's how business is being done now. It's understanding that when you're talking about progress, when you're talking about economic development, when you're talking about people's lives. And if we're really committed to inclusion, because inclusion, despite it being a noun, it's a verb, right? It's an act that requires us to be constantly working at it. And so it's not just a matter of putting a woman or two, or a Black person or two, or a person with disability or two at a table. And yeah, we want to be at the table, but please also know that it's a cultural shift, and that is the most difficult part, but it's a long-term commitment. And so being the organization you are today and the organization you're committed to being in 5 years will look different and can only benefit. I mean, I don't have to talk about the numbers, the trillions that you quoted earlier, Lori, I think is evidence of what can happen when we do that well.
I personally have reported on companies in the United States that have rolled back some of their investments, or maybe just fallen off schedule with the money they pledged to donate, laid off their diversity and inclusion professionals. The list goes on and on. My colleagues have reported on similar things in Europe. Have you seen things like that here in Canada?
Yes. And I've actually, I know someone personally who is still reverberating from the pain of, one being hired to do the work, not being supported with the resources to back up the work and demonstrate commitment, and then being let go. And it's painful because you go in with hope. People who do this work are the most hopeful people in the world. And so, she's in a state of, what happened, but also in a state of, oh no, I can't believe this happened, and that saddens me. And I'm hoping that that's not the direction that we're taking within Canada to any large degree.
We have decision makers in this room. What do you want them to know about how a decision to roll back a diversity investment looks to investors, how it looks to employees?
I think it sends a message that the commitment was only skin deep. and didn't penetrate to the level of change or seriousness that's necessary. And so if it's only skin deep, things will just go back to the way they were. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to add something, Paulette. This morning I was listening to another roundtable, very, very smart one. And they were speaking about resilience, okay? Resilience, and they were speaking, I took notes, collaborative innovation and capabilities and skills, organization, business, new world, learning. At any time we spoke about people, at any time they spoke about women. We have to assume that. We have to assume that if we want, and we were speaking about climate change, but if we want to change this world, we have to include half of the population, part of the humanity. So we have to include, even in our speeches, the word of women, the word of diversity. And I ask all the men here in this forum to assume and to help us to change this world, to change the business. What they said this morning, but with adding the word of inclusion, women, diversity.
Absolutely. Great point. I would be remiss if I did not ask about changing sentiments as well. Some of the rollbacks we've seen have not just been motivated by economic concerns, they've also been politicized. And in the US, there has been a movement to attack organizations that make gender-focused decisions. And I know there's been a bit of that in Canada as well. And Lori, although I know you work in emerging markets, are you following this? What do we need to know?
Yeah, and I think that and I certainly don't want to generalize because every emerging market is very different, and even within different markets, there's a lot of different, a lot of differences even within markets. So, but I would say, unlike what has been occurring maybe in Canada and the United States and potentially in Europe, many emerging markets are just a different part of the conversation. And I'm actually quite optimistic about where they are. They're at an earlier, again, I don't want to generalize because it's terrible to do so, but it's an earlier point of the journey around gender and diversity and inclusion. And there's a different appetite of receptivity there. So I would say that it's less about sort of the rollbacks and doing less as opposed to that curiosity and understanding, looking at the opportunities and the risks, and providing that acute awareness. So again, not wanting to generalize, but I think I'm optimistic in terms of the work that we're doing in emerging markets to help bring gender diversity and inclusion to the fore.
But do you have advice for those of us in the US and Canada and Europe about how to react and respond to those criticisms, whether it's boycotts or social media attacks?
Wow. Well, put me on the spot. So, I mean, I would sort of take a sort of my own philosophy that would be stand firm. I mean, if you're convicted about it, one has to stand firm because it's not only a right thing to do, but it's also good for business. Again, I won't go through all the data points and everything, but it's morally the right thing to do, ethically the right thing to do, and from a business perspective, it's the smart thing to do. So stand firm and weather the wave, weather the storm. And surround yourself with people who would support that perspective, with your executive team and what have you, get support from the board. But again, it's the right thing to do and have to stand strong.
Well said. Well, we're running low on time, but before I let you all get back to the rest of your day, I wanted to do a bit of a rapid fire round. Paulette, I think I'll start with you since I started with Lori last time. Is there one challenge that you are concerned about more than others? And if you have a solution, please share it. But if not, let us know. But what is the one challenge you see as the biggest barrier to increasing inclusion?
Actually, it's related to what you just asked, Lori. Yeah, and so I am concerned about the impact of social media and the attack on those who are doing incredible work in the skins and bodies that they're in, and being the reason for the attack, as well as the messages that they're sending. And I think that those of us with various kinds of privilege need to lift them up. I think that's part of the solution. So if we see someone that's being attacked because they're addressing a particular issue around, it could be LGBTQ issues. It could be something around any kind of justice area. Take a moment to lift them up. Let them know they're not alone, because these are dangerous times. And even though it's an online attack, sometimes it goes beyond that. So I think we have a responsibility as a society to respond as people who are committed to equality and justice, to say something and to support that person and make sure that they have the knowledge that they're not alone.
Élisabeth, what about you? What do you see as the biggest barrier that we're currently facing?
Well, the biggest barrier and maybe the solution is to have more women as role models. It's not only because you're a CEO that you're the only one to be a role model. We all have a real role to play in this place of gender equality. Within ENGIE, we are lucky. We have the first women CEO of the CAC 40. Now there are only three. And Catherine McGregor, and she's really great. But she said, well, okay, Élisabeth, I will be a role model for you. But I want you and others and all of you, all the women, being role models for all the youth and the young people. Okay? So that's very important. So it's one of the, for me, having more role models, being ambassadors of our cause of gender equality is really key to change things within the company, within the civil society as well, and within our world for tomorrow.
Lori, I'll give you the final word.
I think it's sharing the information to show the opportunity. Again, it's about risks and opportunities, and then turning that into action. So it's going from opportunity and insights into action. I think that's the biggest challenge, and it's because it is a journey. I keep saying that, but it is a journey, right? One small act can unlock another action, can unlock another action, can unlock another person as part of the conversation, and bring them into the fold. So turning opportunity into action.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to each of you, Lori, Élisabeth, Paulette. It's been fantastic having this discussion. I know I've learned a lot, and I have quite a few insights that you will soon be seeing on the pages of the Financial Times. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation as well. And with that, I think we'll head out. Thank you so much.